Hi, welcome and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining SSR's webinar today. My name is Han. Today, we have invited Ms Tey Mei Qi, Senior Medical Social Worker from Assisi Hospice, to share her work on bereavement coping among bereaved family caregivers in Singapore. This is based on her master's thesis at NUS Social Work Department. We also have Dr. Ivan Wu, Principal Medical Social from Tock Seng Hospital, as the discussant today. The Q&A with the audience will be moderated by Ms Chee, co-founder and executive director of the Compassionate Network. We are recording this webinar on Zoom and streaming this live on Facebook. So your participation in this event indicates your acknowledgement and consent to this. The speaker, Mei Qi, has kindly agreed to share her presentation slides, which we will circulate in a follow-up email after the seminar. So for the Q&A later, we will accept questions in two ways. First, you may post and vote for questions via our Poll Everywhere link, which I will share on the Zoom chat later. Alternatively, you may use the virtual raise hand function on Zoom and unmute your microphone to speak after being called by the moderator. Please remember to indicate who your question is addressed to. And we will not be taking questions from the Zoom chat and Facebook comments section. As we have a limited amount of time, we apologize if we are unable to address all questions. SSR is offering a new training workshop on methods for collecting data from children and adolescents. Dr. Sia Lei Hun, our Senior Research Fellow, will provide an introduction on methods such as ethnographic observation, visual-based methods, and methods involving props, together with their respective strengths and limitations in the context of social service-related studies. If you're interested in this course, please scan the QR code on the screen to find out more. And with that, I will now pass my time over to Mei Qi. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to see all of you here today. A little bit of a self-introduction. I am a social worker by profession and also a graduated research student with NUS Social Work Department. And currently, I am actually working as a hospice social worker and a mother of two lovely children. Yes, so for today's seminar, I'm actually expecting fellow social service practitioners in the field, healthcare providers from various disciplines and settings, and also researchers and those that are working in the academia, including the ministry. Our objective is actually pretty simple, which is to share research insights and practice knowledge that is relevant to the social service sector. So I'm really very hopeful that by the end of today's discussion, all of us, including myself, will have certain learning points regardless of the profession or the setting in which we work with. Okay, wait, let me see. I will put this at the end. Okay. So content-wise, right, I will actually be talking about the influences of good death concept on bereavement coping among bereaved family caregivers in Singapore. This is the research study for my master thesis, and I will use the standard structure of a research paper to do the sharing. However, I will not be placing much focus on methods and results because they are actually published in two parts, in two journal articles. So if you are interested, right, a lot more details can be found there. Okay, so let's move on. What is a good death? Yes, so if you Google good death now, right, this is the definition that is most likely going to pop up on your search engine. But what I believe is that it's not just about what is a good death, but why is it so important that we know what constitutes a good death? And why are we always so curious about it and talking about it? Yeah, and I do believe that in the crux of good palliative and end-of-life care, it lies the question of whether terminally ill patient had a good death. and also what constitutes dying well, because it is really very difficult to achieve it without knowing what it constitutes. So what do we already know about good death? What we know is that there is indeed very little agreement on what defines a good death, and that is also because the conceptualization of a good death, right, very much depends on our culture, our values, and our lived experiences. So it is actually highly individualized, and it is well known, especially for my fellow colleagues who is in the healthcare scene. We know that patients and family caregivers often do not share the same definition of what dying well looks like. And we also know that research has found very often as healthcare providers, we tend to have rather idealized notions of what a good death should be. And such misconceived ideas, right, can actually hamper our ability to be creative and spontaneous in delivering quality care. And I do believe that it is our responsibility to find out what is our individual patients' preferences, including their loved ones, their family members, who actually play a very important role in supporting and caring for the dying person during end of life. And while we know that good death is so fluid, right, we are still very curious. Researchers like myself still wants to pursue knowledge in this area. That is because we do know that a person's perception of a good dying process for their loved ones is actually predictive of their bereavement outcomes. And when I was embarking on this study, right, I actually do have this working hypothesis that a person's concept of a good death is most likely going to influence the way they make meaning of their caregiving experiences. And that as a result can also affect the way they cope with bereavement. And I'm also very, very curious as to what are the social and cultural influences and factors that are prevalent in our Singapore population, and whether if there is anything that's uniquely for Singapore. Okay, so when it comes to examining caregiving experiences, it is also well understood that illness trajectories actually differentiate advanced cancer patients from those with end-stage organ failure. So one is a lot more predictable and usually a downward trend, whereas the other one goes up and down and a lot less predictable. As such, caregiving experiences can actually look very, very different depending on the type of terminal illness. And it is also well established for bereavement studies. Most of them are actually on spousal losses. So that also means that the findings might not be representative of other loss types. So as such, right, for this study, I actually use relationship types and illness types as two variables. So it will be spousal loss versus losing a parent versus cancer or end-stage lung or end-stage heart diseases. Concurrently, I'm also aware that when it comes to good death concept, what we are most familiar with are the Western attributes, such as being pain-free, having no unfinished businesses, having autonomy. So existing literature, right, did suggest that the concept of filial piety and what it means to be a family might actually influence adult children's caregiving attitudes and their experiences. So these are actually at the back of my mind before diving into data collection. And when we look at bereavement experiences and coping, there needs to be some form of theoretical and conceptual framework to ground the study. And I have chosen the dual process model as a guiding framework, mainly because its universality in application, both as a conceptual framework and also as an assessment and intervention tool. So ultimately, right, we do need evidence-based, theory-driven bereavement interventions that are culturally appropriate in our local context. Okay, so for those who are not familiar with the dual process model, this is what it looks like. And this is the revised version in 2016 that has actually included the concept of overload. Those that are familiar, just bear with me for a while. I'll do a very quick crash course because I think the understanding and the subsequent parts will depend on this piece of information. Yeah, so when we look at bereavement experiences and coping, right, when it's explained in a very simplified manner, it means the ways in which bereaved family caregivers manage the stressful situations that follows the loss of a significant person in their life and the negative emotional reactions to grief. The dual process model, right, is a framework that describes the way in which people come to terms with their losses, and it was originally developed to understand spousal losses. If we look at the left-hand side, loss-oriented grieving processes, those are usually centered on loss experiences itself and with respect to the deceased person. So it is similar to traditional grief work, such as rumination, missing a person, yearning for the person. On the right side, restoration-oriented grieving processes, they are focused more on the secondary losses. So we are looking at secondary sources of stressors, such as having to take over the roles and responsibilities of your late spouse or your late parents. However, you can't be grieving all the time. So while having these two types of coping strategies, right, it will also be embedded in our everyday life experiences. So it is similar to as though like you're taking a time off from grieving. And what we believe in this model of what is adaptive coping, right, is the oscillation between loss-oriented and restoration-oriented grieving processes. So naturally, we do expect more loss-oriented grieving processes at the initial stages of grief. In the revised model, overload was defined as the bereaved person perception of having more than he or she feels that they are able to deal with. So the concept of overload actually draws more attention to the mental and physical health complications when a bereaved person is overloaded, and whether is it with the loss experience itself or the secondary losses. Okay, so this brings us to the study objectives, which is to examine the attributes of a good death for terminally ill patients as perceived by their family caregivers, and to discover whether there are any influences on their caregiving experiences and subsequent coping. So some of the research questions that we are trying to answer over here is, what are the perception of good death for either a dying spouse or parent? And how did the perceived good death influence their subsequent caregiving experiences and coping? Whether the dual process model is relevant in representing bereavement experiences and coping, and also whether are there any coping mechanisms that support the principles of DPM in adaptive coping with bereavement. I will move very quickly into methods. So we have a purposive sample of 15 bereaved family caregivers who have lived and or cared for their dying spouse or parents, and they are recruited from a local hospice. Using the interpretative phenomenological analysis approach, IPA for short, all the one-to-one interviews were audio recorded, transcribed, and entered into en vivo for thematic analysis. So quotes were extracted from the narratives to support the findings, and they can be found in the published papers. Okay, so I would like to take a moment to pause and really ground all of us in the spirit in which this study was conducted and the way in which we can look at the results later. So in my journey in doing this paper, right, the focus really isn't finding an absolute truth to the research question, but it's really the whole idea of discovering what are our collective experiences in Singapore and finding knowledge in that manner. So I actually felt very validated when one of my social work senior read the paper and told me that whatever findings that was discovered actually speaks of what practitioners actually see on the ground on a day-to-day basis. Yeah, so moving on to results. This is a very busy slide. I will go through it slowly. So in total, right, there are actually 14 sub-themes that were identified, and they are categorized into 4 major themes. So firstly, right, for the concept of good death, it has been widely researched and established that it is a multifaceted and fluid construct. So as such, right, the key attributes of good death, right, were defined based on bereaved family caregivers' perspectives throughout the caregiving experiences and bereavements. The first attitude, right, the first attribute is actually caregivers having fulfilled their conviction to care. So from caregivers' perspective, a good death actually means good death. And interestingly, their caregiving attitudes actually differ according to the kind of social relationship, as married couples or as adult and child relationship. So for spousal caregivers, right, their caregiving attitudes were very much rooted in their commitment to their marriage, and it is actually expressed in a way as a sense of spousal responsibility. Whereas for adult children, it is actually that deeply ingrained belief that they have to care for their parents, And a likely explanation is actually their sense of filial responsibility. And unlike the spousal caregivers, they tend to be less aware and less able to articulate their reasons of caregiving. If we move on, the next 4 attributes, right, are actually perceived good death for the deceased deaf and dying. Mainly, it is important that their late spouse or parent had lived a good life, fulfilled their end-of-life preferences, and had least suffering. So when we look at caregiving experiences, it actually starts at a point when caregivers are aware of their loved one's illness to the eventual demise. And the focus of the analysis was whether caregivers' perception of good death influenced their caregiving experiences. So 2 sub-themes are identified for each of the 2 major themes. If we look at the first box, during the caregiving journey, right, family members actually dedicated themselves to meeting the dying person's biopsychosocial spiritual needs and also meeting their own needs as caregivers. And when needs are met, these are often experienced as positive caregiving experiences. However, when critical events are poorly managed or when the caregiving journeys were met with a lot of challenges, right, this will often result in negative caregiving experiences. So in essence, right, depending on a person's definition of good death for their dying parents or dying spouse, interaction or experience, right, can be experienced as positive or negative based on that definition. Okay, so these all have influences on subsequent coping with bereavement. I will first focus on the dual process model. So expectedly, if you look at the first 4 sub-themes under this major theme, they actually mirrored the well-established components of the revised model that I shared earlier. So for all bereaved caregivers in one way or another, they coped by centering on their loss experience itself and grieved over the death of their loved ones. In the loss-oriented mode, right, they usually respond with coping methods that confronts their grief to achieve adjustment to their loss. So what we commonly see are acute grief reactions, revisiting memories of the deceased, and even relocating the deceased emotionally to continue bond. If we look at restoration-oriented grieving processes, it is focused very much on the secondary consequences of the death. So instead of confronting one's grief, they actually distract themselves from the loss and focus on rebuilding their life without their loved ones. And as I shared earlier, part of bereavement coping is to take respite from grieving itself. So we do see themes that surface regarding their everyday life experiences that are unrelated to bereavement. While most caregivers have their fair share of difficulties coping with bereavement, a small handful actually had more detrimental effects on their mental health. However, this subtheme was not the most prominent due to the selection criteria of the study participants. Because to be recruited for this study, participants actually self-reported they were coping well as early as 6 months into bereavement. So what is most noble is actually the final subtheme, which I like to draw everybody's attention to. It is this prospective dimension of bereavement that is characterized with thought processes and behaviors that are geared towards reconstruction of positive meaning. So that actually includes positive reappraisal of caregiving experiences, reviewing of their life goals, and moving into grief, moving beyond grief to embark into a new chapter in their life. So this subtheme actually speaks a lot about hope, a lot about optimism, and it is very prospective in nature. And it actually concretizes into actions that build a better future for them. So if we are going to look at all the 4 major themes together, it actually paints a very comprehensive picture of the influences of good death concept on the way they experience caregiving and subsequently how they cope with bereavement. And the cognitive processes of meaning making becomes that common thread from their caregiving journey all the way to bereavement. Okay, so I will move on from here. Moving to discussion, right, I would actually like to emphasize some of the points that I have made earlier and elaborate a little bit more on practice implications. Okay, so firstly, the concept of good death really is an intermix of the East and West. So this actually aligns with an earlier study that was done on the Singaporean concept of good death. There are actually many common attributes with the westernized concept, such as having lived a good life, fulfilling end-of-life preferences, and having least suffering. What is unique to us, right, is actually the idea of caregivers' conviction to care. So I do hope that the key takeaway for everyone is to assess if caregivers have that conviction to care. As a practitioner, as a hospice social worker, I know that it is not present in all the family caregivers for various reasons. But for those that do have the conviction to care, they feel that they are responsible to do so, we need to support them in fulfilling it. And whether is it for their sense of filial piety as adult children, whether is it to fulfill their marriage vows, or even other lost ties where you start to understand where they are coming from. The next point that I would love to make is that bereavement care really is part of palliative and end-of-life care. So we really shouldn't and we cannot look at them separately. And I believe that this is something that all the veteran practitioners in our field would agree with. It is definitely not rocket science that meaning making plays an important role in bereavement. And what is established in this study is that meaning making did not start suddenly when a person passed away. So that also means that bereavement care cannot start after death. We need to think about what happens upon death as early as when the family start in their caregiving journey. So knowing that a person's perception of a good death actually forms the basis for meaning making, yet it is also highly individualized and it is an ever-changing concept. It only means that we need to figure out throughout the caregiving journey, we need to be comfortable to constantly explore and understand what does it mean to die well for their loved ones and for themselves as caregivers, and to constantly tailor our interventions with all these implications on minds, in our mind. So I do feel that it's very important actually for us to be less fixated on our idealized notion of what a good death might be, and be very comfortable to go with the flow, and be very comfortable for people to change their mind about things. Okay, lastly, I am actually very happy to know that the dual process model actually mirrored very well some of the bereavement experiences and coping that is seen within the Singapore population, because this also means that we can tap on the wealth of knowledge on the DPM, and also interventions that were designed based on DPM theories and concepts. The whole idea that we need to be evidence-based and theory-driven. And beyond the commonly known components of the revised DPM, this study also identified another important part, which is the reconstruction of positive meaning. So based on the studied narratives, bereaved family caregivers who achieved positive reconstruction of meaning saw beyond their loss and they grieved adaptively. So they actually progressed beyond the oscillation between loss-oriented and restoration-oriented grieving processes into a very adaptive state of bereavement, where their focus is no longer on the death event, and it's not about the deceased, but how they want to live their life differently and constructively because of their loss experience. And this prospective element may actually be important both as an assessment and intervention tool to bereavement work, where positive reconstruction of meaning can be assessed as an outcome of adaptive coping. And second-order change interventions can be geared towards achieving these adaptive states of bereavement. Okay, so a little bit of sharing, like how does it change my practice as a social worker in that few years during my master's thesis? It actually made me a lot more cognizant and a lot more observant to the family caregivers that we support in the process. And I do make it a point to ask questions very intentionally on what does caring for their loved ones mean to them? What matters most to them in this journey as a caregiver? What gives them meaning and value to their role? So it's not just about caring for our patients and asking what matters to them as a dying person, but also asking our caregivers, what does it mean to them to be doing caregiving? And one of my favorite questions, it didn't originate from me, I learned it from somewhere, yeah, which is to ask, what do you need to do now, such that years down the road, when you look back at this time, you still have no regrets? And very often when I ask this question to family caregivers, right, they are surprised because often we are so focused on our patients, we forget to ask them how they are doing and what it means to them. And many of them actually need time to go home to start to reflect about it. Yeah. And those working in the healthcare setting, we work in an interdisciplinary team. And I do feel that as social workers, as medical social workers, it is our role to constantly be the voice of family and also to bring across all these questions. What is the implication of our care plan on family during bereavement, not just during the caregiving period? And also how much are we comfortable and willing to prioritize the caregiving needs of the family without compromising on patient's care? Okay, so I will move on to conclusion very quickly. So caregiving experiences were made meaningful based on bereaved family caregivers' definition of a good death, both in terms of the death and dying process, and also their role as a caregiver. So there is two dimensions to it. And two ways to go about fulfilling their conviction to care, right, is really supporting them in achieving it when their loved ones are still around, and also work on meaning making and sense making if at that juncture you already know that successful dying is not feasible based on their perception. However, even if the dying process and death event itself were not well managed, the ability to do meaning making work actually do open up opportunities for therapists and practitioners into the bereavement phase in doing grief interventions. However, we want to intervene as early as we can, knowing that the groundwork for bereavement care actually lies in pre-death support. And as social workers, we always know that it is better to do preventive work upstream than to do remedial work downstream. Yeah. So rising above all, another important thing that is discovered is also that of positive reconstruction of meaning within the narratives of the bereaved family caregivers. And it actually suggests a very promising outcome measurement to adaptive bereavement coping, so that practitioners can actually assess for successful oscillation between loss-oriented and restoration-oriented grieving processes by identifying these adaptive states of bereavement. Rising above all that has been shared, I would also like to make a point. So if our lived experiences are actually the basis in which we make meaning of and we make meaning for our future, that also means that conversations about death and dying really do not need to wait till time of illnesses. So instead, even today, we can start talking about our end of life preferences and to have all these conversations when you are healthy and when your loved ones are healthy. I should have one final slide. Yes. So coming to the end of my monologue, this is actually a quote from one of my favorite books on dying well. I'll just read it out. So years ago, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross envisioned a future in which dying was embraced as part of living, and in which the care of the dying was an integral part of the life of the family and the life of the community. Children who have been exposed to these kinds of experiences in a safe, secure, and loving environment will then raise another generation of children who will most likely not even comprehend that we had to write books on death and dying and start special institutions for the dying patients. They will not understand why there was this overwhelming fear of death, which for so long covered up the fear of living. And this is also my dream as a researcher, as a social worker, and a mother of two lovely children. Yeah, and I hope to share this with all of you over here. Thank you all so much for all your kind attention. The slides will be given to all of you. Yeah, so these are the two publications, and together with my thesis mentor, Dr. Lee Gyok Ling. The first one, I think there should still be e-copies available. If not, feel free to email me for it. The second one is on open access, so you can just Google, it will be available. Yeah, so now I will stop sharing screen and to invite Dr. Ivan and Wai to join us. Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Mei Qi. So, yeah, before I hand over the time to Dr. Ivan Wu. So just to inform everyone that the Ms Tee's slides will be shared after this seminar in a follow-up email. Yeah, so do look out for my email, and if you do not receive it after the seminar by next week, then please feel free to email me for it. So now I'll hand over the time to Ivan for the discussants' comments first before we going into the Q&A with the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Zhihan. Thank you, Ms Qi. I thought I'll break down what I have to share probably into two parts. First is I would like to comment on the strengths of Ms Qi's studies. Before coming on some questions that I have, as I was reading through the two articles that she's published and the slides that she's come up with. So I must say for a student assignment, Ms Qi has done an excellent job, and I really the fact that she could actually even publish them itself, right, is really telling me that it goes as expectations that and compared to a lot of other students itself, they really don't get their studies published, and in order to get published, whatever study has to be current. Yeah, I think the focusing on the dual process model of coping with bereavement and mini reconstruction, they are actually very current itself. If you look at all the theories, the thoughts about grief and bereavement, increasingly there are a lot of people who have a lot of interest in looking at meaning, how people make meaning, reconstruct meaning, and really looking at real meaning-based intervention. So that really tells me that it's current. The other one is a dual process model of coping with bereavement. There are many coping models out there. And this particular model, it resonates a lot very well with clinicians because as they think about the practice and look at the model, they read out the model itself, they realize there's something that can actually apply to their practice. The constant challenge about dual process model of coping with bereavement is actually the validation of this particular model, especially the part about this oscillation. Then this actually brings me to the questions that I have. I'm just wondering, when Ms Qi was conducting the study, does she have any insights about this oscillation? Because oscillation is among all the coping models that people have used to work, guide their work with bereaving individuals and bereaved individuals. What is very unique about the dual process model of coping with bereavement is this oscillation. Yeah, I thought it would be good if, let's say, we could actually throw some further light on this oscillation. Now, the other one, as I was looking through the slide on the results, I'm just wondering whether it looks a bit too linear because there I can see that the attributes of a good death itself in then get translated into this positive caregiving experience. But it could actually happen the other way as well, because how a person experience the caregiving itself, right, could actually determine how they actually perceive what a good death itself or what are the attributes itself. So perhaps Ms. Qi could actually give us some insights on that. I mean, and that really writes on to her earlier point about how our experience itself does have an impact itself. Because I think it's something that probably should be a lot more dynamic. I don't see it something that's that linear itself. And she did mention also in studies, there are some unique cultural kind of insights that she gotten from it. So I thought it would be good if she could actually share with us, a bit more about, what are some of the things that are more culturally specific, starting over here. So I think these are essentially some of the key points that I have, and perhaps I could just hand the time now to Ms Qi to probably just give a quick response before YE comes on for the Q&A session.
Okay. Ivan, you just catch me, right, if I missed out any of the questions, okay? Yeah, so I'll start with the oscillation first. I would say that because I collected all the data, all the stories together, and I'm listening to it, right? The chronological order is not, I'm not able to catch, like, did they get here first, go there then, so on and so forth. But when I hear the stories collectively together, right, both of it actually appears. So it's actually pretty obvious, right? There is that oscillation. Yeah, and one thing that I do notice, right, the oscillation is actually a little bit different for the spousal losses and the parental losses, interestingly. And we know that dual process model actually is developed from spousal losses because it was based on their narratives. Yeah, so what I discovered is that first I go overall first. Overall first at the initial stage, right, it is true. Loss-oriented grieving processes is really more intense. But as you hear them talk about it, right, the other aspect comes out. Yeah, and something that I thought is really interesting, right? Usually when we read the dual process model, right, we don't pay attention to everyday life experiences. We think that that's just something at the background, not very important. It's important. It's very important because I didn't ask anything about it. It actually surfaced naturally in their storytelling. And I actually do notice that spousal losses, they talk a lot more about their everyday life experiences. They talk a lot more about restoration and loss oriented. Whereas for those that lost their parent, it's not as prominent, the themes. And I was even able to identify for some, they don't even have that acute phase. There was such an they say that after my parent passed away, it felt pretty much the same. Life goes on. But that is not representative of everyone. Yeah, because in that study, the one that actually showed mental health implication is actually one who lost their parents. Yeah, so that actually will also go back to the concept of good death. That actually influences it. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, thanks. So actually, I have further questions based on what you have shared. So in social services, because we don't just work with the individual, a lot of time we work with the family unit.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering, the participants actually share any insights on the length of caregiving and whether the length of caregiving itself has an impact on how they perceive what a good death is like, and whether there's an impact on actually the meaning making process itself. That's one. The other one I'm just thinking about is about what I call as a out of sync. So what happens is, what if a family member, okay, because a death in a family doesn't just affect one individual, it affects a few family members. Have you gotten any information on maybe some people having focusing on loss orientation and some restoration orientation, and then there's some tension itself. And then I mean, and this is in clinical practice, we do see that sometimes there's just that imposed expectation on how you should grieve, right? Yeah, and then it has a lot it has a lot of relationship to the whole concept of disenfranchised grief. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
So I'm just wondering, are there any insights to this, so that it could actually guide us in probably working with family as a unit?
And okay, we start with the length of caregiving. So initially when I started out, right, I really believed that illness trajectory, length of caregiving, this should matter. Surprisingly, it didn't really come up. Yeah, surprisingly, that didn't appear because I thought that should be something that's important. That sounds common sense, right? So the length of caregiving, right? So when I went in, I was looking at the final stage of caregiving, but they talk about longer length, shorter length, so on and so forth. Nothing very meaningful actually surfaced. And what came out more prominently, right, is that regardless the length of caregiving, were they able to care for their loved ones in the manner that they want? Yeah. And also, when it comes to the family component, right, there is actually a difference between spousal and parents. So for those who are caring for their spouses, right, it's very individualized. I am the only spouse. I am the only one that's responsible. It's my marriage spouse. It's me. I don't need my children. I don't need everything. It's just me. I want to be the one that do that. It's till death do us apart. It's just the two of us. Yeah. And it's very interesting because those who cheated on their wives, is still strong. So they can be so upset in their marriage, but that spousal responsibility to care remains. Yeah. And for the other one, which is for children, they actually have this idea that it's shared responsibility. So that tension did appear a little bit, but it really wasn't the area of where I'm digging for information. So I didn't really study so much into it. Yeah, but there is this whole idea where for children, right, they actually do have this expectation that we should share the load. So in their narrative, there is a lot about how my brother did this, I did this, they did that, then we come together, and so on and so forth. So even in something that I didn't publish in the papers, but I recommended in my thesis is that when working with spouses and working with children is a little bit different. For spouses, it is really it's very intimate, it's very special to them. And even if you have a very elderly lady in the ward coming to visit the patient on a daily basis, right? Give her something to do. It's important to her. But whereas for children, right, they might expect you to can you go and also speak to my other siblings, gather together, can we iron out a little bit what it should be? Yeah. So does that answer the out of sync part?
Yeah, so I think that the out of sync, perhaps I could actually just clarify a little bit. Okay, because I know you interview general individual. I'm just thinking from their narratives, right? Was there any point where they mentioned that they were like focusing on the loss orientation, and then the family member who believe that you should just get over it, they are on the restoration orientation, and if let's say they do have family members like that who couldn't appreciate their preference for the loss orientation, right? Did it affect the oscillation? Did it affect sort of the outcomes of their grieving process now?
When I was, because these participants were pretty much handpicked lah, those that are coping well. So the theme of disenfranchised grief didn't surface very prominently. But in the narrative, if I compare between the spousal and the parents' loss, right? For those who lost their parent, even for the children, they talk about how I don't understand why my mother is not moving on. Yeah, and we need to move on. We need to move forward and look at how to get our life going. There is Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. We need to go on. I don't remember this narrative that they shared. Yeah, so there is, but it didn't surface very prominently on like how one is more on loss oriented, one is more on restoration oriented. But I do remember quite vividly that the participants were aware that they are stuck in it. They are aware, and they are also aware that their family members are not. But then they reached the conclusion that I simply needed time, and eventually, when I'm ready, I will snap out of it. So because all of them are adapting, coping well lah, so there is no maladaptive adjustment. So all of them, by the time I interview them, they have already come to terms and they have moved. Yeah.
Thanks, Ms. Qi, for sharing that. Yeah, I mean, even the studies that I conducted, I realized that generally the people that we have managed to recruit are people who reported a positive outcome from their grieving process. Yeah, then which actually is a major limitations in a lot of different studies out there. Yeah, and then how do we then capture that group that somehow report poorer outcomes who actually struggle with this? I mean, by inviting them for interview, most probably they wouldn't be interested to come on board itself. Perhaps it would be good to look for other sources of data itself. Perhaps like case records from this inputs from these clinicians. That may be potentially a source of data that would give us further light on the difference between those who reported a good outcome versus those who don't. Yeah. So I thought this probably would be something that the audience for this particular seminar could actually just think about. Yeah. The interview as an approach may not really work quite well for people who probably are challenging. I mean, they find that
will not be able to pass IRB actually.
Yes,
but
yes,
they are the group that we want to study
yes,
so that we can inform interventions.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yeah.
I totally agree with it.
Okay. Yeah. I think I noticed the time is now 4:15 and we're running very tight timeline. Maybe you can just invite Wai to actually join us. Yep.
Okay, thank you, Ivan and Mei Qi. So now I'll invite Wai to moderate the session for Q&A with the audience. So just a gentle reminder for audience that you can ask questions two ways. One, using the Poll Everywhere link on the Zoom chat, or if you wish to speak up directly, you may use the virtual raise hand function and unmute yourself after Wai calls you. And also a reminder to indicate who your question is addressed to. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Jahan, and thank you to Mei Qi and Ivan. Yeah, first to Mei Qi for the presentation, and then to Ivan for starting the conversation and really warming us up. And it's then my role now to invite our participants here today to also join in this conversation. Yeah, I have a few questions here that I see loaded on the poll everywhere. Okay, so some of which I think you have already started talking in the earlier conversation, and let's kind of extend it a bit, right? I must apologize, I may not be fielding the questions according to the number of votes, yeah. But if Mei Qi and Ivan have a look at those questions, you will see how reflective our audience this afternoon is. I think they go beyond your study, Mei Qi. And they started asking many questions that could possibly be future research questions. Yeah, so let's see how best we could piggyback on your research to inform what possible directions we could take for these questions that may or may not directly be related to your study. One that really caught my eyes is the question of whether, Mei Qi, you have seen any characteristics of the two types of caregivers, spousal caregivers and adult children caregivers, that were associated with this notion in your study of conviction to care. Yeah. So your conviction to care, basically you have two, right? One is the filial piety, one for the children, and then the spousal responsibility. Now in this, were you able to identify certain characteristics that inform you, okay, these are the things that when I see it, yeah, it tells me is their level of conviction to care.
I actually found it pretty interesting. Out of all the 15 participants that I interviewed, they all have it. Yeah, so I do not know whether is it a selection criteria thing or not, because in my practice as a hospice social worker, I tell you confirm, not everybody has it. Yeah, some of them might not have this strong conviction that I want to take care of them. So I might not be able to speak about it from a research point of view. Yeah, I can speak of it more as a hospice social worker lah. Not that I'm a very experienced one, few years only.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I realized that we cannot assume. So sometimes when we have caregivers who look very bochap, like they don't really care, we just didn't ask the right questions. Yeah, always ask, always be very tentative. And this is also the spirit of this particular study. We go in not knowing, we go in not being assumptuous, check in. And based on what they are sharing with you, right, that's how you tease out, is there really this conviction to care or not? And don't because after this study, then you always think must be spousal responsibility and must be filial piety. It might be something else. Yeah, just that these are more common for these two types of losses, but there might be some other reasons as to why that conviction to care is very important.
I have something that I am very curious about when you talk about the conviction of care. If I may just ask a further question, based on what was posed by the audience here. Now, for me, whether it's filial care, filial piety, and now when you speak about the spousal relationship, I always hear two dimensions. That's how I put that and mirror it according to the dual process model. When it comes to filial piety, there's this dimension of love and there's this dimension of responsibility. Yeah, and in Singapore, you know us, we are not very good with our love languages, except to do things, and feel very responsible. So I do come across caregivers who cannot tell the difference between being responsible and being loving. So they think that I must be so responsible. If not, I'm not loving enough. So they measure their love by how responsible they are. So I wonder in filial piety, even for some, they say, I do it because I am a child, not because I love my parent very, very much, right? In fact, I may have a very ambivalent relationship with them, but everybody expects children to take care of the parents. So I do it out of responsibility. That could be one dimension of filial piety too, right? But there are those who are really driven by my love for my parents. It could be out of gratitude. It could be out of what other aspects of love, dimensions of love, that they want to do it. So in your study, right, when we look at conviction of care, particularly for filial piety, adult children caring for their parents, do you see that, right? Do we have more talking about responsibility? Do we have more talking about because I do this because I love my parents, and whether that kind of perception affects their experience of caregiving and subsequently the bereavement experience?
I can share a little bit more on it, and it's something that actually didn't go into the papers. Yeah, when I was listening to the narratives, right, the idea of filial piety is actually also based on this idea of reciprocity. So for the spouses, right, it's a bit of like, is I take care of you, you take care of me. But for the adult children, right, it was a little bit of a role reversal. So last time when I'm young, my parents took care of me. They changed my diapers, they fed me, so on and so forth. They are the ones who tuck me in bed and give me a kiss on the forehead. Yeah, and so therefore now I am the one that tucked my father in bed, give him a kiss in the forehead. And the doing part, right? I would say that the study wasn't sensitive enough to pick it up. But in my experience as a practitioner, the doing is very, very prevalent, and it is almost equivalent to the way they love. And sometimes we even need to address the doing portion because it actually affects the care. Yeah, that means they are doing certain things, making sure that their loved ones eat, but actually appetite is not there anymore. Yeah, and then this is how the whole meaning making component comes in, because in their idea of caregiving responsibility, right, is that it is my duty to make sure that the biopsychosocial spiritual needs are met, which include appetite, which include feeding, the physical care. And when they feel that they are unable to accomplish that physical care part, right, that actually make them feel that these are all challenges in my caregiving journey. Then that is actually how, right, it then spiral off to how they view this caregiving experience and all. Yeah, so it is actually tied together. And if I can draw back to what Ivan was sharing earlier, right? Is there a two-way process? Yes, there is. There is. So as they are caregiving, right, and as we have conversations, right, sometimes it then goes back to them realigning. Actually, then what is a good death? Maybe it might be something else. And you can sometimes see that happening in the bereavement phase also. Doing that realignment, and then that concept of good death, right? My study can't show that but it then follows them to the next dying person and their own death and dying. So it doesn't stop. Yeah, it keeps going to and fro, to and fro, to and fro, which is why when I was analyzing the data, right, the concept of good death is not at one juncture. I capture both sides of it. Yeah.
Interesting, because to me as a practitioner, I would even link it back to the settings of care, right? Now, if someone who is able to do things for their loved ones at home versus someone who has to send or decide to have their loved one be cared for and die in an inpatient facility, when the doing part is shared by the clinical team, they don't do so much now. Is there a difference, in terms of how they perceive their ability to fulfill all this conviction of care, and subsequently the impact on their bereavement experience? So
It came up.
it came out, right? Yeah, okay, I just suspect. Okay. Now, coming to that, really, I think we're wanting to stretch this concept on good death. Now, I'm going to ask a few questions all at once, and you see which one you want to respond to, because they're quite the same type of question. One really asks, tapping on the good death concept, how can we support caregivers who suffered sudden deaths of the deceased? Okay, sudden death is one. Another one is suicide. Okay, does this still apply? What about the good death concept when it comes to those who are bereaved by suicide? Okay, then there's this other group. They really want to stretch your study to cover not only adult caregivers, not only adult children caregivers or spouses in the context of hospice. They also wanted to ask good death across siblings, right? Plus, also, if it were a parent losing a child, then they wonder what this good death perception might look like. Okay, so pick any of these subpopulation. I think Ivan can chip into. We have the suicide, we have the parent caregiver caring for a very ill child, right? We have sudden death, we have across siblings, etc. Does the good death good death concept apply to these other subpopulations?
As a researcher, I definitely will not make that claim. Yeah, but the thing is that, right, there is this idea where if the death is sudden, right, it is very similar to how successful dying cannot be achieved because we do not have that runway when the person is still around. Yeah, then that really then goes back to the whole idea, right, where even if you really miss the boat and something that really did happen during the dying phase, there was very bad experiences with healthcare providers, there's this belief there was negligence and so on and so forth, which are good predictor of bereavement, poor bereavement outcomes. That is when we really need to move into meaning making. Yeah, it really moved into that dimension where we have to fall back on everything else that we know as social workers, the therapeutic work. Suicide across sibling, losing children, not just that it's not in my research, it's also not in my area of expertise as a practitioner. Yeah, so Ivan, any inputs on that?
I was just listening to the conversation, and I would like to go back to the idea of filial piety that was brought up earlier on. I think there's a lot of insights that we could glean from reading about ambiguous loss, the term that was coined by Pauline Boss. So she actually looked at how for a person who's caring for people with dementia itself, right? Even you had a filial piety, but sometimes because of the change in personality itself, you don't seem to recognize this person anymore, and then you tend to struggle inside. And in her book, I think there are some suggestions on how you can actually reconcile that. There are also literature out there you can just search ambiguous loss itself with people with dementia. I think you can get some insights from there. And that will help you reconcile. So essentially, we're trying to reach a place where there is that what I call the coherence and congruence. So coherence, when it comes to meaning making itself, right? I think if people want to have a coherent narrative, then how do you actually help work with them to create that coherent narrative? Now, when it comes to sudden death itself, right, it reminds me of the work by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning. I mean, if you look at the death of people in the concentration camp is senseless. Right? I mean, the thing is, no one will actually say that it's good death itself. But yet the thing is, if you look at whatever it has been done, right, the search for meaning itself is actually therapeutic. Yeah, because the ongoing search itself, right, gives them a purpose in life. Yeah, it can be lifelong itself, but it sustains them. Yeah, and I think as much as we would want to achieve that good death, that I think a lot of perhaps um, colleagues over in or people over in the United States, they will actually want that. So because they seem to want to achieve that. So, but in my conversation with colleagues from Europe, they seem to have a slightly different view. Maybe because they are not more familiar with Viktor Frankl's work itself, and they thought that not all deaths is going to be good death itself. There are some where at the end of the day you would need to be able to come to terms. So, if you read the literature on this meaning reconstruction, right? There are actually three essential things that they look at. One is sense making, whether you can make sense of the situation, whether you can find benefits of it, and then whether there's identity reconstruction. But all these three elements need not be present together. Yeah. So I would imagine somebody who have actually lost someone to suicide, right? It probably may be very difficult for them to actually make sense. Yeah, it will take quite a bit of time itself. Yeah, benefit. I mean, they probably feel very insulted if you're going to ask them about benefit. Yeah, but certainly they can grow to become a different person. Yeah, I would want to actually focus on how that incident has actually reshaped how they actually look at things in life, how they actually reshape themselves as an individual itself. Yeah, they perhaps the world is not as rosy itself, but essentially what is it that they have actually gain from the experience that they could actually bring forward in their life. Yeah, and if I'm going to look at meaning reconstruction itself, a lot of things probably will not make sense. But how can we then help them create a new narratives that they can carry on with them now? Yeah, it's going to be a bittersweet experience, and I'm a firm believer that grieving doesn't end. Okay, but how can we then have this narrative that can bring with us in our grieving process until we breathe our last breath in this world? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah. If I may just add on, all these different kinds of death, yeah, and how it impact the people with different relationships with the disease is what Ivan alluded to, how we need to look at helping people to look at a positive reappraisal again. And that's part of needing reconstruction, right? What they have alluded to, all these questions, one is the dimension of the event of death. Sudden suicide, these are event of death. The other dimension is relationship to the disease, right? Then I haven't talked about, is it siblings, is it spousal, what's the quality of the relationship, etc. And the third dimension in meaning reconstruction is really about the person, the bereaved person. So there are some factors associated with the bereaved person, yeah, that may not be associated with the death event. Even if it was an expected death, they might not see it as a good death, right? Yeah, so it could also be related to the person. So in using meaning reconstruction to guide our intervention, I think we have to consider all three aspects and the impact of this notion of good death on these three aspects. Definitely suicide is not a good death to start off with, right? And that already is one down. So a lot of work we have to do to support people who are bereaved by a sudden death and suicide. I call that dissonance, right? When we have more knowledge about this notion called good death, yeah, it's a double-edged sword, right? Then we start having an expectation of what good death looks like. Oh, so sometimes for some people, it becomes a checklist, a checkbox that I need to tick, tick, tick. If I have accomplished all this, yeah, it looked like my loved one has a good death. Right? But sometimes in cases of suicide, sudden death, I don't even have a chance to be a caregiver. Right? And then when I look at good death, using that same checklist, I said, okay, yeah, I didn't meet any of these. Right? So it can then develop into a dissonance, grief dissonance, when some of these notions of expectations, whether it's cultural or personally imposed, is not met. So I really enjoy this piece of work when we look at a good death. I wonder then in that context, right, whether you see across, there's this question about across different age groups, yeah, of caregivers and adult children, do you see any differences in terms of how they perceive this concept of good death? For example, spousal loss, you have someone's spousal loss at 30 versus 40 or 50. You have an adult child who's at 50 versus adult child in 70. Any differences?
Definitely, yes. I will start with the spousal one. So for spousal, right, if for the more detailed analysis, those that are older and those that are younger is very different. Unfortunately, I only have one who is young with children. The rest are all elder spouses, which is actually another limitation of bereavement work and research lah. Is usually spousal losses among elderly people. Yeah, so for those that are elderly, right, it is really a lot of having lived together with that person for such a long time. The whole having to not just grieve over the loss of this person, but also that secondary loss of how am I going to live my life without this person being my daily part of all the things that I do. Whereas for the younger one, there's just that one participant, but it actually come out very clearly. The loss oriented, right, wasn't that strong. Don't have time to grieve. They need to move on. I got 3 young children. I need to take care of them. So it was a lot of focus on how I need to bring people in to change the light bulb, like literally the light bulb. Like I didn't expect the light bulb to appear, right? Because always ask how many social workers to change the light bulb. But yes, the light bulb did appear. Yeah, so it's a very different kind of narrative. So one of the limitation or recommendation, right, is really looking at age. Yeah, because I do believe that age actually differentiate the bereaved groups, even if the social relationship is the same. And
How about, go ahead, yeah.
then when it goes to for adult children, right? Those with children, I do recognize that they are a little bit torn. So they need to take care of their children while at the same time taking care of their family. Yeah, but something that's very interesting, right, is that even though they are very, very much older, 50s or 60s, they actually talk about the feelings of become an orphan. and a few of them talk about it, both the young ones and the older ones. And it's about how like, it's so weird, right? I am a mother with children now, but you know what? When both of them died, I feel like I am an orphan now. And I heard it several times in quite a handful of narrative. Yeah.
So this other question is about, what about spiritual belief? How does it affect the concept of good death? I think there was something in your study that there is a
But not
sub-theme
very
on spiritual
strong.
belief.
Yeah, because it is that, unfortunately, because I didn't hold it as a variable, right? It was Chinese Christians. Yeah. So if I'm looking at Christianity itself, right, that alignment of spiritual belief is very true. Yeah, because this whole idea of I will meet my loved ones afterlife. And some of them, even as spouses, right, before the husband is ill, already start praying to God that can you find some ways for my husband to believe in you so that we can meet eventually in future, even though we will not recognize each other, but we'll meet together in afterlife. But then that is one of the limitations because all Chinese, all Christians, there wasn't this different aspects of Buddhism, Hinduism, Roman Catholics versus Christianity, and all the smaller religions. So that's another limitation. But I have one who is an atheist. Yeah. And she actually shared that it's also alignment. That means me and my father believe that there is no afterlife. Just die, then okay lor, just move on already. Yeah, but the fact that two of them are comfortable with it, right, is as though like they're in tandem like that. And she spoke about it. Yeah, then she said, I also don't know whether
It's
got
about
afterlife.
alignment, isn't it?
It's the alignment, but I don't
About the
feel
beliefs are specific.
yeah, but I don't feel very
spiritual-
comfortable to make it a very strong stand on it. Because for the Christianity part, they want it to be the same religion.
Right. Okay.
They come out very strongly.
So this person can do a future study on the impact of
That
spiritual
would be a very complex and
on
impressive
good
one.
death. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to combine the next two questions, and I think Ivan can really chip in on this as well. One question that just came in asked about what are some national level policies or responses that we need, in Singapore as a society to evolve to the ideal state that Kubler-Ross spoke about. And this related to another question asked, this concept of good death, how do we apply it across the various ethnicities, religion, and cultural heritage in Singapore? So the diversity at national level, what can we do?
Maybe let me just share about my thoughts about good death. I think when we frame our thinking and we start to think about good death, we limit ourselves. I remember I attended the Association for Deaf Education and Counseling conference that's in the United States a number of times, and there were a few conversations that I had with colleagues over there, and we were talking about good death, and I think general conclusion we seem to arrive at is it seems that the concept of respectful death is a lot more applicable than good death. Like earlier on, because we talk about people who died by suicide or others, I mean, there's no good death itself, but certainly the people who have died can be respected, can be honored. Yeah, and a lot of bereavement work that we do, so it's actually to help people come to terms and ask them, how can we then honor the person who has passed on, regardless of how they died? How can we then respect them of the life they have lived? Because a lot of times they're just so focused on the death incident, they actually omitted their entire life. But they have, from the time they are born until the time they die, there certainly will be areas where they have made significant improvement, significant contribution to society. Can we honor that? Can we respect that? Can we actually spotlight that? So that they will not live a life in vain. Yeah. And we can actually give purpose to the life they have lived. Yeah. So this is, I thought, um if we are able to focus on respectful death itself, right, that's going to then frame a lot of the work that we do itself. That's going to we have to rethink about wanting to keep focusing on a good death itself. And in our clinical practice itself, we can then try to bring the bereaved individuals from thinking about good death to this respectful death itself. Yeah, I thought that is probably a very important paradigm shift that we have to create as practitioners working with bereaved individuals. And if you're looking at your bigger picture, like the policy level itself, right? I think if you're able to then have a paradigm shift to really focus on respectful death itself, right, that's going to get us starting to think about, how do we create a compassionate society where all deaths are respected? Yeah. Regardless of the type of death, regardless of circumstances itself, how do we respect that death itself? Yeah. And how do we have a society that comes in so that, every individual is being honored, everyone matters. Yeah. So that, down the line, then everyone who have passed on itself would know that they would be able to die with dignity. So I think really that's really at the broader level that I think we could actually make that change itself. And once we get the principles right, once we get the values, the belief right, and if let's say there is sufficient, that there's a critical mass that believes in this itself, right, policies, program services will also have to shift. Because the thing is, in Singapore, where everyone will vote itself, right, for who would become the government of Singapore itself, a lot of times the people's voices matters. So if let's say everyone were to speak that language and they say want to work towards respectful death itself, then I think the policy everything has to shift it so that it will be aligned with the beliefs of the entire population.
Ms Tey, any response from you?
I'm really learning a lot from Ivan and you today. Yeah, but going back to the question, right? When I was much younger, I actually very idealistic. Yeah, and I actually have this envision, right, where it's very normal to die at home. Yeah, it's okay that you go and visit your friend. There is someone that is actually terminally ill in the bedroom somewhere. It's okay. Do we really need to go to a hospital for drugs? Can we go to a GP that I have been caring for me, my whole family for 20, 30 years? And then subsequently, when I fall ill, this person actually also journeys through with us. How much of it needs to be so specialized? How much of it needs to be so medicalized? Actually, how much more we can actually push it to the community level, to primary care setting. Yeah, but I know all the policy thing, it will come back to me. Yeah, but that is really how I see it. Yeah, and that it's not about building more hospices, and it's not about building more specialization after specialization, but it's really to make death and dying very common. Like we all know what are the drugs involved when you are dying. Morphine is not scary. It's just a normal drug law that we take when we are in having a lot of pain. Secretion, just take this medication, is okay. So how that can be into our community social fabric. Yeah, and social workers all around, they don't need to look at like palliative social workers as like, wow, that special breed can do death and dying one. But like everybody need to learn about child protection, right? And we all need to be suicide trained, and we all also need to do family violence training. Then why not death and dying? Yeah, can we make it more general than specialized lah? And this whole mindset shift that we all need to know a little bit about it, because we are all dying. Our loved ones are all dying. There is no way you don't need to know this information. No way. Yeah, so that's that idealistic me talking.
Totally agree with you. I think we should move into what some people have termed as death literacy. Right? It's really raising the death literacy for our population as a whole to really level up. Yeah, and not only depending on specialized workers when it comes to death, and to normalize death as part of life. Yeah, so one last question for you, Ms Tey. As a practitioner, so I'm bringing back the practice question. I really like your slide about some of the questions we can ask caregivers. And for myself, I do use that same question that you mentioned. What you have to do now as a caregiver in order that in time to come, you will have no regrets, right? I use that a lot in my current new organization, the Compassionate Network, to support caregivers, right? So these are questions that would be good in practice when we support someone upstream while they are still providing caregiving. My invitation to you is, would you also like to share with us, when someone is bereaved, what kind of questions do you ask, really, to explore the bereavement coping in relation to the notion of good death? Any suggestions for us who are already seeing someone that is bereaved?
I'll be honest that is really not my best forte, because I really focus a lot on pre-death work. but I do have a few bereaved cases that I used to hold last time. And I do believe that it is really being very open, right? To go in to ask them what their experience was. Was there any conflict? Was there something that didn't sit well with them? One thing that I realized interestingly when I did my research, right, is that when I went in as a social worker who used to care for the loved ones, I hear this narrative. When I did my research, it is still the same group because it's the same hospice. But then that's when I went in with as a researcher, I hear a lot more. Yeah, and that's when I realized that actually some of the things is actually quite hard for them to say. If you're still wearing the same hat, you're still from the same agency. But interestingly, when I went in as a researcher and I asked very simple, direct questions, all these things surfaces out. So I don't think there is a very special or unique question that we need to ask. But the question that I actually asked is, what was your relationship like with your loved one? How was your caregiving journey like? In this caregiving journey, what are the things that govern you? Was it your religion? Was it your values? Was it certain life experiences? How do you view the death and dying process? What was it like? And back then I went in not as a clinician, as a researcher, so I need to do it in a different way. Yeah, and all these things actually surfaced. And that was a wake-up call for me. Very interestingly, my research role actually wake me up as a clinician that I don't know so many things. They didn't tell me. I went in, I asked before, they never told me. But when I went in as a researcher, I asked a very simple question, everything came up.
Wow. So
Yeah.
some research questions are useful for practice also, right?
Exactly. And it's very simple. It's very simple. It's not difficult at all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for the encouragement. We want to see more research coming out from this area of bereavement. Ivan, any last word from you before we close the Q&A?
So I'd like to address the earlier question that asked Ms Qi. Now, very often in bereavement work, we tend to revisit the past, which I think is over already, and I don't see a lot of value in it. In my practice, a lot of time I like to use the stop chair, the stop empty chair technique itself, because I think it's really focusing on the impact of the past on the here and now. Yeah. So when we are here and now itself, right? I don't have a fixed question, but I thought a lot of micro skills that we learned in school, those of you are interested, you can actually read The Skilled Helper by Gerard Egan itself. So you have things like attending, probing, paraphrasing, summarizing. Those are very simple but very powerful skills,
Yes.
okay, that we actually use, right, to actually look at the here and now. And then from there to see how they can move on with that, from that session focusing on the here and now. And it's not rocket science, but the thing is, it takes practice to be able to what you call it as practice that art of bereavement care itself. I think that really is a challenge for a lot of people providing bereavement support now. Yeah, so this is what I hope you take away. I mean, when you do a bereavement, a lot of people talk about past itself, but people then in some ways they get stuck there. But I think it's important in our role to see how we can actually bring them from there to the here and now. And then it's only when we can actually get them shift to the here and now, then that's where they'll be move on from here. Yeah. That's all I have to share about that. Thank you.
So being laser focused, really focusing on so what? Yeah, the impact. It's not about the story from the past, but what's the impact on the person? So what? Yeah. Mei Qi, your last word before I hand the time back over to
Thank you,
Chee.
Ivan. You allow me to look back to the main discovery, which is prospective dimension. Compassionate presence, very important. What you need pre-death and post-death is the same set of skills. It's very simple, yet very difficult. I am still learning. Yeah, and just keep focusing on loss-oriented and restoration-oriented. Look at perspective dimension, the futuristic, the hope, the optimism. Because if you look for something, you will get that. If you don't look for the other one, it will not appear. Yeah, so be intentional, but also be comfortable with bearing witness to suffering. Sometimes they just need us to listen and be there. Be comfortable with the pain. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Right. It's been a really lovely afternoon to be able to have this conversation with all of you and the audience. I'm so sorry there may be one or two questions I didn't get to ask and address it, but looking at time, I have to pass it back to our organizers. John, thank you.
Thank you, Wai, Ivan, and Mei Qi. Spent a few months preparing for this webinar. And thank you to our audience as well for joining us this afternoon. So I quickly launch a simple poll to everyone. Greatly appreciate your feedback on how you think about our webinar today. And just to share on the screen a highlight of our upcoming events in the coming months. So our next event will be our annual conference about youth mental health in March. So our slots for in-person attendance is full, but we have a waiting list. And alternatively, if you do not mind joining on Zoom, you can still do so. Just register on our website. And yeah, we also have our monthly seminar will resume from April. So yeah, thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. We have come to the end of the session. So for the speakers, I will send a follow-up email after the session with you. Thank you so much for your time, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.